All right, y'all. Well, today we are going to be going through the beginning of the Gospel of John, John chapter 1, the first 18 verses, also known as the prologue of the Gospel of John. And the reason we're going to be going through this today is to answer the following questions. Who is this word, or in Greek it's logos? Who is the Son? Who is Jesus? Is Jesus God? Is Jesus the logos? What's the deal with all this? Well, thankfully, if we read through John verse by verse, he answers all these questions for us very, very clearly. So let's get right into it. John chapter 1, verse 1 says this in English: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, when we see this word here, the Greek behind it is logos. Now, if we read the Greek, it says, "En arche ein ha logos, kai ha logos ein proston theon, kai theos ein ha logos." Now, there's two very important things about this first verse in John. The first important thing is that we can divide this up into three clauses. The first clause being, "In the beginning was the Word." The second clause being, "The Word was with God." And the third clause being, "The Word was God." The second very important thing about this verse is the fact that John is pointing us back to the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And the reason he's doing that is because if we take a look at the Greek here, en arche, in the beginning, this is exactly how the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, starts. All right, in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew, which existed around 300 years before the birth of Jesus, it says this, en arche, the same exact phrase that John starts his gospel with. Now, what's so important about this phrase, en arche, is that most Bibles translate it in the beginning. But when we look at the Greek and when we look at the original Hebrew, we see something interesting here. If we're going to translate this woodenly and literally, we would not translate it as in the beginning, but we would translate it as in beginning, because there's no word the. There's no definite article. The Greek phrase en arche and the Hebrew phrase bereshit are telling us that this is talking about something completely outside of time. This is not talking about a very long time ago. This is talking about before creation, when the only thing that existed was God, and time has not yet existed. John is using the same phrase to point us back to the book of Genesis to tell us, hey guys, I'm talking about the same exact thing that Moses wrote about in the book of Genesis. So when we read this phrase, en arche ein ha logos, or in English, in beginning was the Word, we can translate this as, before time began, the Word was already there. In fact, many English translations will translate this verse as, in the beginning, the Word already existed, or in the beginning, the Word was already there. That is a correct translation. So this is telling us right now that this logos, this Word, already existed before anything, before time. Then we get to the second clause. The Word was with God. So here we see something very interesting. We actually see the Word existing, or the logos existing, in some kind of a relationship with God. And we're also seeing a distinction here. We're seeing that although we know God alone was the only thing that existed before the creation, we're seeing that there's a distinction here. There's the logos and there's God. And if we take a look at the Greek, it says, kai ha logos ein proston theon. This preposition right here, pros, this actually designates a relationship or a proximity or a closeness or a nearness, even somewhat of a reciprocal face-to-face kind of ordeal. So it's very interesting that we see before time even existed, the Word or the logos was already there, and this logos was with God in some kind of closeness or vicinity. Then we get to the third clause here, which says, the Word was God. In Greek, it says, kai theos ein ha logos. Now, this right here is telling us that the Word himself was in essence God. This is not telling us who the Word is, but this is telling us what the Word is. The Word is in essence God. Now, how do we know this is the proper interpretation? What we have right here, the third clause of John 1:1, is what's known as a preverbal anarthrous predicate nominative, which is just a whole bunch of fancy talk for saying that this sentence, instead of having a subject and a predicate like a normal sentence would have, it has two subjects. Two subjects. God and logos are both subjects. And when you have two, they're called nominatives in Greek, and the first one comes before the verb without the word the, it's almost like putting an equal sign there. It's basically telling you, what is this logos? This logos is God. Now, again, I say this is answering the question, what is the logos, not who is the logos, because we're going to see later that there is a distinction in personhood between this logos and God himself. So, what do we see here? This word existed before time. He was in relationship with God, which might have you scratching your head. How many gods are there? But then it tells you this word was God. And right here, this is a clear teaching of the complex unity within the one God. Right now, John is telling us that this one God who created everything exists in two distinct aspects. Just based on this text alone, we're seeing two distinct aspects within God. There's God and there's the Logos. Then we get to verse number 2. It says again, he, speaking of the Logos or the Word, was in the beginning with God. We're seeing again that in beginning, before time, in the Greek, outos, ein en arche, pros ton theon. Before time began, this Logos was with God. Now I need to talk about this word outos here, this pronoun, because a lot of people will teach that verse 2, a lot of modern English translations translate it like this: he was in the beginning with God. But a lot of people say you can't do that because the Greek doesn't signify he. It's a neuter pronoun, so it has to be it, speaking of the Logos, was in the beginning with God. Well, I'd like to say this. Both translations are possible and both translations can be correct. But if anybody ever tells you that he is an incorrect translation, they are wrong. Because when we look at the Greek in verse number 2, outos is a second declension masculine pronoun. You can tell because of the omicron sigma ending here. And even just the Bible software here will tell you masculine singular nominative, which can be translated as he. Okay, logos is a masculine noun. Therefore, any pronoun that's talking about the logos has to be a masculine pronoun. So it is correct to say he was in the beginning with God. Now, some people don't like the word he because it denotes personhood. I'm here to say, no matter what way you translate it, whether it was he was in the beginning with God or it was in the beginning with God, John is later going to make clear whether or not this Logos is a person. Is this Logos God? Is this Logos Jesus? John is going to answer all these questions for us. Now we get to verse 3. It says, all things were created through him. Speaking of the Logos, all things were created through the Word. And without the Word, nothing came into being that has come into being. I guess this translation says, all things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. So verse 3 is now telling us, not only did this Word exist before time, not only was this Word with God, not only was this Word God in essence, but this is the creator of all things, everything. In fact, just to make sure you're super clear on all things, it doesn't just say all things came into being through the Word. It even goes on to say that apart from the Word, nothing came into being that has come into being. Now, if everything that exists came into being through the Logos, through the Word, this excludes the Word from being part of the creation. This means the Word or the Logos is not something that began to exist at some time. This Logos, this Word, is in fact the Creator. And when we read Genesis 1:1, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, en arche epoesen hatheas tan aranan kai tain gain, the Word, the Logos, is the person doing the creation. Now, you might have a few questions here because we're just dealing with Logos and God, but John's going to be now answering and fleshing out, okay, so who is this Logos? Does he have anything to do with Jesus? Is he God? Like, what's the deal? John's going to be going into much more detail here. But so far, what do we know? So far, we know this. The Word existed before time always. It was with God in some kind of relationship. It was in very essence God. And this Logos is the Creator himself. This Logos is how God created everything. All right, and this actually lines up perfectly with Genesis 1, where we read every time God creates something, it says, Vayomer Elohim Yahi Or, Vayomer Elohim Yahi Rakia. God said, let there be light. God said, let there be a firmament. It's the Word of God that is causing creation to come into being. Now, We also know from Scripture that God alone created the heavens and the earth. We know from Isaiah chapter 44, verse 24, that God says, I alone am the creator. I alone am the maker of all things, stretching the heavens by myself, spreading the earth out all alone. All throughout the Bible, God says, I am the only creator. And so now in John 1, verse 3, we are seeing that, yes, this creator actually has multiple aspects to himself, a complex unity. So now let's go on. In verse 4, it says this, in him, speaking of the Logos, was life, and the life was the light of men. So now we have John calling this Logos the light. He's using a different word for the same Logos. Now when we get to verses 9 and 10, what does it say about this light? This is the true light which is coming into the world, who lights every man. The light was in the world, and the world was made through him. So verse 9 now is telling us that the light, who is the Logos, according to John, who already existed before time, who was God himself, the creator of all things, is now coming into the world, which was made through him. The Logos is now entering into his own creation. Very, very interesting. The world was made through him, attributing the creation once again to the Logos, who is also the light. And if the Logos is coming into the world which he made, that means unequivocally that the word here, the Logos, the light, has to be Jehovah, Yahweh, the creator God. Now we get to verse 14. We're going to skip ahead a little bit because this is very important. It says this, the word, the Logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, this is very interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, now this is absolutely ascribing personhood to the Logos, to the Word. Why? Because a father is a personal relationship. You cannot have a father, you cannot be the only begotten son unless you are a person, having personhood. So we know right now, based on verse 14, the question of, is this Logos a he or is it an it? Well, based on verse 14, the Logos is in fact a he, because now John is saying this is the only begotten from the Father. Also, verse 14, very interesting. The Word, the Logos, who always existed before time was, who was always in a relationship with God, who himself is the creator God of Genesis chapter 1, this Word is now becoming flesh and dwelling among us. So this is where there's some kind of a change, because the Logos, not ceasing to be what he always was, eternally God, is now taking on a nature which in time he never had been before. Up until this point, the Logos had never been born through a woman entering into the creation. Yes, he has appeared many times throughout history, to Abraham, to Moses, to the elders of Israel, to Joshua, to Samuel, to Isaiah, to Ezekiel, but he never has become flesh in the sense that he was born through a woman. And now this is what John is telling us. This Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We saw his glory as the only begotten of a Father. And it's very interesting that we see here that although he didn't cease to be God, he did start to be something that he never had been before, which was a human. Then we get to verse 18, which ties everything together. It says this, no man has ever seen God at any time, but the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. All right, now there's a few different ways to translate this. We're going to be breaking it down into the Greek because I think it is important to break it down in Greek. But the one translation puts it this way, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who himself is God, is in closest relationship with the Father. He has made him known. Let's talk about the first part of this verse, because we can break this verse 18 into two clauses. First part, no one has ever seen God. All right. Now, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures tell us over and over again that nobody can see God and live. But yet, the Old Testament also tells us over and over and over again that people have seen God. For example, Genesis 18, Abraham sees God. God appears to Abraham as a man. They eat together. They talk together for 2 chapters. Exodus 24, the elders of Israel, they see the God of Israel. Exodus 33, Moses talks to Yahweh, the creator God, face to face as a man talks to his friend. And my favorite, Numbers chapter 12, verse 8, Moses sees the very image of God. God himself says, Moses sees my image, the same word that's used in Genesis 1:26 when God says, Na'aseh Adam B'Tsalmenu, let us create man in our image. Moses sees the image of God. Isaiah saw God. Ezekiel saw God. And when Ezekiel saw God, he also did look like a man. But my point here is this. There's a mystery. Why does the Bible always say no one can ever see God, and yet people see God? Big mystery. John's giving us the answer right here. It's because of this. The one and only Son, who himself is God, who is in the bosom of the Father, or is in close relationship with the Father, he has made him known. Now in Greek right here, we can see that it says monogenes theos, the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father. He has exegeted him to us. So the answer to the mystery is this. The way man and God can interact, and man can see God and not die, is because the Son, who himself is God, is the interface through whom man and God can have relationship. When you see the phrase in the Greek, the monogenes, the only begotten theos, this is saying right here that the Son is himself theos, theos being the Greek word for God. The Son is God, and he's in relationship with God, and he's the one who allows us to have relationship with God. And once again, in verse 18, what do we see? We see personhood of the Logos. We see a father-son relationship. We see a distinction between the Father and the Son, and yet we see that they are both called God. They both share the same essence of being God. This is all based on the text of John 1. Now, it's important that we understand this context as we read the rest of the Gospel of John. This is how John wants us to understand the rest of his Gospel. And let's just reiterate what we're talking about here. The Word, the Logos, always existed before time. He existed with God as being distinct from God, and yet by his very nature, he was God. He always existed in the beginning with God. He created everything, and not one thing that exists came into existence without the Word or the Logos. And then it goes on to say that no one has ever seen God at any time, but the one and only Son, who himself is God, he is the one who has declared God to us. So this is what John is teaching. So the clear and obvious reading of this text is that, yes, the Logos is talking about Jesus, because when we get to the Son of God, Jesus identifies himself as the Son all throughout the book of John. Jesus says, I'm the Son of God, I'm the Son of God. Well, according to John 1, the definition of the Son of God is that he himself is God, who always existed in relationship with the Father. Jesus is the Logos is the Creator God. God exists within a multiplicity of persons within himself. And I hope you found this video useful. If so, like, subscribe, click the bell. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.